Secretary of Communication. I also serve in my regular role as Assistant Director of Testing and Assessment. Welcome to our session today on Women in Environmental Science. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Cristina Cardona, who has achieved the rank of Associate Professor in the Physical Science Department. She earned a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Environmental Science, as well as a doctorate focused on marine estuary environmental science and an online asynchronous general education science course. She has studied abroad at the University of East Anglia, UK, and has participated in the prestigious STEM Seas program aboard the research vessel Thomas G. Thompson. Last year, she was invited to present at 4 conferences, including the American Geophysics Union. She also engaged in the School of Rock NSF program aboard the now decommissioned JOIDES Resolution. This program has led her to have hands-on experience with ocean sediment cores. She offers several STEM-related experiences for students at CCBC, including an Honors College Chesapeake Bay program that will take place this summer. Dr. Cardona, thank you.
Thank you. So, ensure it's the correct thing.
Good now. There.
All right. Thank you for that warm welcome. So originally when I said I would do this, I said environmental science, but really I picked mostly women in oceanography. So I would say it's more earth science, but you can see them all in environmental science context. So I selected 3 women that not everyone outside of oceanography knows who they are. So we have Mary Thorpe, Sylvia Earle, and Rachel Carson. All experienced sexism, and Rachel Carson actually experienced homophobia as well because she was a openly gay woman. And all encountered struggles during their education and careers, but they all paved the way for women in STEM now, especially in oceanography, that is a mostly white man-driven field. There's very, very little diversity in oceanography. Out of all of these, the only one that's still with us is Sylvia Earle, who is 89 years old and still scuba diving, still trekking up and doing what she loves to do. So I'm going to start off with Mary Thorpe. She was a cartographer, and does anyone know who she is? Have you heard about her before? Just one person. She's associated with plate tectonics. Who do you normally think of when you hear about plate tectonics? Do you know?
Alfred Wegener.
Alfred Wegener, yeah. Not very much credit is given to Mary Thorpe unless you've taken a class with me, as he has. But Mary Thorpe is the reason we have a theory of plate tectonics. Everyone gives credit to Alfred Wegener, who came up with the continental drift theory in the 1910s. He came up with the idea that the continents looked like they could once fit together. They had similar rock pieces. He was a paleoclimatologist and geologist. So he studied fossils and rocks and to study the ancient climates of different continents. And he found that there's plenty of evidence to show that the rocks on the east coast of South America and west coast of Africa were the same age and same types of rocks. And we had fossils of tropical creatures that crossed lines between continents, including Antarctica, which, if Antarctica was always where it is now, it would make no sense to have tropical reptiles or ferns. But he made the connection that these were all once giant supercontinent known as Pangaea at one point. And of course, he didn't have enough evidence to explain the how or why that was possible. So he called it the continental drift theory, saying the continents drifted away from each other, plowing through the ocean. And there he was laughed at. He was a laughingstock. And he died in 1930, frozen in an Arctic climate, sad, everybody thinking he was a crazy man. But you have to think about the fact that in the 1910s, 1920s, we didn't have a lot of information about the ocean. We still don't. We know less than 5% of what's down there right now. But you have to think about what could a cartographer use to map out the ocean floor. So something happened in World War II that helped us collect data that helped us get to this point. So what in World War II would we have that would give us what the ocean floor looks like? I don't know if I should pick on Xander again. We go for it.
Was it radar?
Close. What's in the ocean that's not radar, but it's sonar. Sound and ranging, it's an abbreviation. But basically in World War II, they used to do a lot of sonar readings to map out to see if there were submarines of the enemy below the ships so they wouldn't get killed. Later, in the 1940s, 1950s, they were able to collect all that data, and we had Murray Tharp, who was able to map out the ocean floor, especially starting with the Atlantic Ocean, because we had so much data between Europe and the Americas, as that's where a lot of the sonar data was collected, where the enemy territory was, right? So she was a cartographer and did a lot of this data analysis because she, as a woman, she wasn't allowed on a boat. Historically, sailors have had a lot of superstitions, one of which was it's bad luck to have a woman on board. It's also apparently bad luck to have pigs and bananas on board for different reasons. But she was not allowed on board, so she just took up after her father and became a cartographer and just mapped out the data that was collected during World War II with sonar evidence. And what was unusual about her data is that if you think about what like the ocean, the vast ocean looks like, what would you think the middle of the ocean would look like? Would you expect it to be anything or flat, the deepest point? Like what do you expect would be the middle of the ocean?
An abyssal plain.
An abyssal plain, flat, featureless, boring, probably the deepest part of the ocean, right? Dark. But she discovered a rift. So she kept on mapping and mapping, and it kept on showing up like a mountain range where the spot in the middle, so we call this a rift zone, across the entire Atlantic Ocean. And her colleague, Bruce Heisen, dismissed it and said, that's just girl talk, and literally erased her data and her maps and made her start all over again. But she did, and guess what she found? The same thing, because she was right the first time.
Marie went back to her maps and redid everything. She redid the height maps, and the data still showed evidence of a rift on the ocean floor. Howard Foster was mapping earthquake activity in the same area, so they decided to compare maps. When they overlaid their maps, it matched. Even Bruce was not in agreement. This rift existed, and therefore, so did continental drift. Together, Marie and Bruce published their findings, but the scientific community wasn't convinced. They wanted hard proof, so they turned to the newly invented underwater camera to figure out this answer once and for all. Did a rift actually exist? They were going to capture photographic evidence or lack thereof. The underwater camera came back with undeniable evidence of the now mid-Atlantic ridge in the Rift Valley. Today, the ridge is considered the Earth's largest physical feature. Scientific community finally believed Marie. Marie's maps uncovered a new understanding of the history of our Earth. Her work paved the way for research in plate tectonics, understands how the Earth moves and changes over time. Marie published the first map of the Atlantic Ocean floor in 1957. She then went on to create a second map, the South Atlantis, and then another map of the Indian Ocean in 1964. This culminated in Tharp completing Marie went back to her map.
Don't worry about it. I could get it finished with the next slide.
Marie went back to her maps and
so basically, most men disagreed with her data, did not believe her, because she was agreeing with that crazy man's ideas from the 1910s that no one wanted to accept, that the continents were moving away from each other. And this rift was evidence that the tectonic plates existed, and that was a boundary between two tectonic plates that were separating and creating new land. The reason there's a rift and mountain here is because new lava becomes young rock, is less dense and rises, so it floats above other rock, creating mountains. And she found mountains along the entire Atlantic Ocean, cutting through even Iceland, all the way through the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, about 10,000 miles of mountain chains that supported Alfred Wegener's idea that the continents were once together as Pangea supercontinent, then now separated. If you watch this other video, I'm not going to show you, but there's this YouTube video you can look up. Talks about even Jacques Cousteau didn't believe in her and was one of the people who pursued the idea of using video cameras to look and actually was shocked to find that she was right. So because of her, we have this beautiful map that shows that 10,000 mile rift system across all the oceans. And so at these sites, we have tectonic plates moving away from each other, showing that at one point, these continents were all together, and they have been slowly moving apart about the rate of growth of your fingernail, about 10 centimeters a year. So every year, we're getting further and further away from Europe and Africa, and getting closer to Asia on the other side, because on these other markings that you can see on these maps are trenches where subduction is occurring and the mantle is being recycled. So the crust is being recycled. So thanks to Murray Tharp, we have the newly formed plate tectonic theory of the 1960s that is still holding true, and all the evidence still points towards this being true and accurate at this point. Then we have Rachel Carson. So she was a zoologist, and she got her master's in zoology at Hopkins in the early 1930s, if I'm not mistaken, something around that time. And she had financial issues, pressures from her family and society to not get a PhD. It was really hard to get a PhD as a woman at that time. So she actually decided to become an editor and read scientific published articles. So she was the second woman ever to be hired by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And she eventually became their editor-in-chief. And what she did for a living was read scientific articles. And she synthesized them. By that, I mean that she was reading through all these articles and seeing what do they all have in common. And she kept on finding patterns and trends in the studies showing that chemicals, particularly pesticides, were causing harm to human health and to animal health in the ecosystem. And so she published The Silent Spring. She actually wrote a couple other books before this, but she published The Silent Spring as a result of all this data in a way that was legible for the public, very written in layman's terms so that the public could understand it. And she raised an alarm that chemicals were poisoning the public and the ecosystem and causing cancers and causing reproductive health problems and killing top predator birds. And basically because of this book, there was a period of time in US history where the Americans were kind of nervous about using chemical pollution or remediation. And because of this, Earth Day became a thing. So as a result of this book being published in the 1960s, Earth Day on April 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, is happening every year because of this. This raised the alarm that we needed to take care of our planet, we needed to do something. So you could say this is the first ever environmental activist book ever written, even though it's a truly scientific piece of work. So it's kind of on the lines of like Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which is a scientific book that was easily understood by the public. That's why Charles Darwin is famous for the theory of evolution, but most people don't know who Alfred Wallace is, who also came up with the same theory at the same time, because he didn't publish a book that was legible and easy to read. Of course, back in the day, people thought DDT, which is an organic synthetic pesticide, was totally harmless. Because in World War I, they sprayed the soldiers that had fleas on them, and the soldiers didn't die, so they were like, it's fine. No one's dying, this is good, and it persists and it kills pests. Let's continue using it, not as cheap, right? These are legitimate pictures from real National Geographic magazines of the time. And I've read many books. I love reading books, and I read a lot of nonfiction and memoirs, and I've read many memoirs from children who grew up in this period of time, and they would say they were excited when the DDT truck would come, and they would go out and swim in it, because it was the cool thing to do. This is like 1950s, more or less. And see, this article from the National Geographic not only had this picture of kids swimming in it, but it says, DDT is good for me. Well, we know better than that now. Because what happens when fertilizers and pesticides and chemicals are put in farms? They eventually run off into bodies of water nearby, like rivers, lakes, name it. So when it rains a lot, all the extra chemicals ends up in the river. It accumulates in the bodies of plankton and plants, it bioaccumulates, and then it moves up the food chain. So one thing you should know is that 10% of energy moves up every step of the way, but 100% of the toxins move up every step of the food chain. So the higher you are in the trophic level, or the higher you are in the food chain, the more concentrated the pollution becomes. So a top predator bird like an osprey, pelican, eagle, name it, they are going to get the highest concentration of toxins when they eat the big fish that ate the medium fish that ate the little fish, and so forth. So the DDT would wash off from fields to nearby streams, then eventually to the ocean, accumulate in plankton and plants, move up the food chain, and what it did was reduce the level of calcium in bird eggs. It would weaken their eggs. And what do mom birds do to their eggs to keep them warm? Sit on them. Right, so splat. You would end up with some cracked eggs. This is what resulted in a collapse of all top predatory birds in this country, to the point where we have like only 400 known nesting pairs of eagles. Bald eagles, the American symbol. That's not good when you consider the size of this country. Thanks to Rachel Carson, we were able to ban DDT in the 1970s. At least in the United States, it's not banned everywhere in the world. Like some places in South America and Africa, they're still using it because it's cheap and they have to rely on it to address malaria and other issues. But here in the United States, we banned it, and we saw a remarkable rebound of all these populations, to the point where I see eagles everywhere. I've been on hikes in Gunpowder State Park. I've gone kayaking in Lock Raven Reservoir and seen bald eagles. I've seen bald eagles in Oregon, in every state you can imagine. So this is a good thing, and it's led to all these top predator birds, ospreys, etc., to come back.
You said 40 eagles, right? I'm just gonna, someone said, wow, 4 eagles. You said
400 nesting pairs, which might seem like a lot, but that's not a lot considering how big. Yeah, that's like 800 birds for the entire country. That's not a lot. And so now we have thousands and thousands of them, which is where it should be. Although for a moment, like a hot second, like 8 years ago, I considered bringing it back, DDT. So we're not home free if people stop believing in the science and stop going back to this this true hero of ours who did this. Sadly, she passed away early in life with breast cancer, which seems kind of ironic. But so she died 2 years after Silent Spring was published. But her work carries on, and like every organization I know of has a research vessel named after her. Like even the Washington State Academic Fleet has a Rachel Carson research vessel. So she is probably the most famous to the public out of the three that I'm discussing because of this. And I found this quote at the National Aquarium here downtown from Rachel Carson, so I had to photograph it, of course. For all at last return to the sea, like the ever-flowing stream of time, the beginning and the end. And the last but not least, she's my personal idol, Dr. Silver Earle, the first one that has that doctor title, right? She is one of the top people to pave the way for women to want to be in oceanography and in sciences that are led by men. She has been around since the 1950s. She was one of the first women to test out scuba gear, or back then it was called the Aqualung, thanks to Jacques Cousteau. She became the first female chief scientist for NOAA. But she actually left NOAA because she felt stifled. They kept on shutting her down because she was showing radical views about protecting the ocean, which I think is what NOAA is supposed to be doing, right? But so she left it because she felt like as a private citizen, she could take on more of a mission of raising alarms that the ocean's becoming more polluted, that oil spills are actually more frequent and prevalent than people know, that overharvesting of fish is depleting our oceans. And we're getting to 5% of what was originally there, actually less than that at this point. So she was one of the first to do a lot of things, and she holds the world record for the deepest dive to this day, using this gym suit that looks like an astronaut suit. She managed to walk on the floor of the ocean at 1,200 feet. No one has beaten her record yet. She also partook in the Tektite project, which was an underwater village where she lived for 2 weeks at 50 feet. Of course, if you look at her, she was a pretty attractive woman. The issue is she dealt with a lot of sexism, and a lot of the newspaper articles about her just referred to her as sexy marine biologist, which now would be really not okay, right? I mean, it wasn't okay back then either, but there was an article that was published, I think, in an African newspaper about how she was about to embark on a voyage with 70 men, but she expects no problems. And she had a lot of jobs that she applied for, but if you looked at a lot of the jobs for marine biologists at the time, she complained about this. They literally said women need not apply. So she pushed through those boundaries and pushed through to say, look, we can do this. But it wasn't just her, it was her whole team. They called them the sexy aquanauts. This is a list of women who lived in that vessel for 2 weeks. Just to show that we could potentially create a life underwater for us. Kind of like a biodome for outer space experiment. And this is another picture when she went back to that vessel to hold an interview to talk about how she lived there for 2 weeks. I also thought it would be good to show her, but I wonder about the echo and all of that. We'll see if this is an issue. If not, I'll.
The world is blue. If you look at it from space, that image should alone inspire us to think that we too are sea creatures. We're as dependent on the ocean as any whale or any coral reef. Take away the ocean and know us. We have looked to the ocean as a place to put things we don't want, and a place to take things it seemed in infinite quantity. We'll never run out of fish, it was thought. We've lost on the order of 90% of many of the big fish like tunas, swordfish, sharks, marlin, cod. Some of the techniques for fishing should definitely be banned. That includes bottom trawling. They're so destructive. It's like using a bulldozer to catch songbirds. You shake out a few pounds of protein, but you've destroyed the forest and everything that's in it. What can you do? Think about what you're eating. Make better choices. Know where the fish come from. I think of the ocean as the blue heart of the planet. Well, how much of your heart do you want to protect?
So that was her speaking. She has a documentary on Netflix, if you have access to Netflix. It's called Mission Blue, that talks about all these issues. And one of the things that is brought up is that we're running out of seafood. Most of our marine fisheries are depleted to levels below 5% of what was originally there, because industrial fishing practices are very damaging, from dredging to massive nets that could fit the Statue of Liberty to these old, they call them the walls of death in Taiwan, that were several hundred miles long and would capture anything that was in its path. So we had bycatch, animals that were accidentally caught in those nets that were not intended to be caught. So like things like whales, dolphins, would get caught in the nets with the fish. Sharks are being depleted to the point where we're going to lose an ecosystem, because a lot of species, let's put it this way, there's like 500 species of sharks out there. A dozen of them are considered keystone species because they help the ecosystem flourish. If we remove them from the ecosystem collapses. I'm talking about great white sharks, your top predators. But humans are over harvesting sharks for shark fin soup and other things, as well as they get caught in these nets by accident. That we are killing over 100 million sharks a year. When people are afraid of sharks, but sharks kill less than 10 people worldwide a year. Doesn't compare. 10 humans to 100 million sharks. And so she talks about that, and she talks about how certain species of animals have been, their names have been changed to make them more edible, more appealing to humans. Like the orange ruffy was called slime heads. So we call them orange ruffy, and now you want to eat them. Same thing with mahi-mahi, which was called dolphin fish. People didn't want to eat them when they were called dolphin fish, but now it's mahi-mahi, so it's totally acceptable. So there's a really funny interview with Stephen Colbert where he says, should we just call earthworms or land trouts or something like that and then make them more edible to humans? And she was like, sure. She doesn't eat fish. She doesn't think we should be eating fish. We should be preserving and creating sanctuaries or marine reserves to protect what little we have left and allow those populations to bounce back, considering less than 3% of the world's oceans are protected. You have to think about the positives of that on the other side. Like, what is a good thing that happens when we protect marine land? Then you have ecotourism. You have money for scuba diving, for restaurants and hotels, and all the travel associated with ecotourism. So she's a huge advocate for that, and that's why she felt the need to leave the NOAA position, because she couldn't do that as a government official. She can only do that as a citizen. Oops. And she also has a quote in the National Aquarium Law, of course, because she's the Neil deGrasse Tyson of the oceans, right? With every drop you drink, every breath you take, you're connected to the sea. The way that a lot of biologists look at ecosystems is that Earth is its own organism, and every piece of that organism helps the system work. If you refer to the ocean as the heart, what happens when you lose the heart? If the atmosphere is the lungs, what happens when you lose your lungs? Like, you look at it that way. Every piece of Earth in the ecosystem is important and has a function. Just like every species, it has a niche or a role that it fulfills within the ecosystem. I probably spoke way too fast because I was thinking I would take this slower, but I see I have a question already.
I was going to say, don't the oceans produce more oxygen than like most of the trees on Earth do?
Yes.
Can you stop the share that way?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm afraid to touch it. But yeah, we get more, and people don't know this, but we get more oxygen from diatoms in the ocean that we call the grasses of the sea than we do from forests on land. So we actually need our oceans as our lungs as well, because they're the producers of oxygen. Any other questions?
Someone in the comments said the news we're speaking on that a couple of months ago down in the harbor of Sydney Marine.
In the harbor?
Yeah.
Are you talking about flotilla? Well, that's normally in the summer.
For sure.
Let me see what the question is.
Yeah, that's good.
The news we're speaking on that a couple of months ago. Oh, about the issue of how we're over depleting our oceans and the fisheries. I'm assuming that's what you meant, because yeah, the Baltimore Harbor has actually gone through a major renovation. We have implemented remediation techniques, from seeing oysters that filter algae to creating wetland restoration projects to allow more wetlands to filter some nutrient pollution, to the point where the harbor is becoming so healthy that we're seeing things like river otters and all kinds of organisms coming back and just frolicking on these wetland projects that they have restored. So if you go downtown, go to the aquarium, around the aquarium, there's a wetland tourist site now that you can go and walk on and see. And they have a camera there, and they film at all hours of the day, and they'll see river otters come up, or turtles. They've had a lot of bird migration increase. We're seeing more, not stingrays, but cow nose rays, more jellyfish. We're seeing a lot more wildlife and diversity in the Patapsco. I mean, yeah. My brain just short-circuited for a moment. The Patapsco River, which is the Inner Harbor. I got confused with the Patuxent for a second. I'm like, no, Patapsco.
Is that a good thing?
Yes. I actually met a guy who did recovery scuba diving, and he said before he could only go by touch because it was pitch black. You couldn't see anything. It was too turbid, too dirty. And this was like 10 years ago. He said, and now, remember 10 years ago, he said, now I can see 10 feet in front of me. So he was curious as to what we were doing. And all these projects are coming together to do that, to the point where the Inner Harbor is swimmable about 165 days a year. You at your own risk. But they do test it every day, so they know if the pathogens are low and acceptable. Yes.
Do you think that, because in terms of the harbor, we have like the trash boat, but then also like the reintroduction of that ecosystem. Do you think that the natural ecosystem is more effective in creating change than like new technology, or do you think they like work well together?
Every piece helps. Like the whole Mr. Trash Wheel family, right? We have now 4 trash wheels collecting litter. Not only does that pick up plastic pollution, it also picks up oil and other pollutants that you would never expect, to the point where it's all those pieces together are the reason we're getting a swimmable harbor. And there's scientists that I'm at the Institute of Marine and the Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology downtown, that strange looking building that's next to the U.S. Guard ship. They are doing all kinds of research to improve the quality of the bay and the river, specifically the Inner Harbor, because they were the ones who wanted to go swimming in the Inner Harbor. So they were pushing for that. I took students there last summer. I know Sander was one of those, and I plan to do that again this summer for those that get into the Chesapeake Bay program through the Honors College. I don't know.
There's a question.
Yeah.
So currently, are there more women involved in this field?
So what I've noticed, and this is not just like I've noticed from reading articles about diversity and inclusion, but also just living life and being in multiple programs, that oceanography, geoscience, geology, geography are all still heavily run by white men. But environmental science has shifted to be more more attracted to women. So, and when I was one of the first, one of the first groups that environmental science was even an option